Hello again. In the previous section, we talked a lot about the importance of financing instruments or financial mechanisms. And we had two aspects why financial mechanisms were important to us. This is transformational change and implementation readiness. Now, what we haven't done, and we're going to do that now, is to talk about the financing mechanism as such, the types of financing mechanisms and the rationale of financing mechanisms. Søren, please, what can you tell us about financing mechanisms?
I'd like to answer the question, or in fact, three questions. One is, who puts these financing mechanisms in place? Two is, who needs them? And three would be, where do we get the money from? And those that put these instruments in place would normally be the public sector. The public sector is usually regulating the economy with financing incentives or disincentives, and those are normally implemented through the tax system. So the public sector is already regulating through financing mechanisms. Now, obviously also those that are regulated by the public sector would typically be private investors. So the public sector is putting into place different financing incentives or disincentives in order to make the private sector invest in certain preferred investment alternatives. And in fact, what we are looking for is exactly the same thing. We would like to see financing instruments that are implemented by the public sector in order to promote the low emission investments. So, the private sector, the reason why, of course, it is the public sector putting this in place is that most of these investments that have emission externalities, you would call them normally, the emissions that are stemming from buying different kinds of equipment, those investments are in most cases done by the private sector. So it is, in fact, the private sector's investments that we are trying to influence through the public sector financing instruments. Now, where do we get the money from? Well, we at the Lama facility is, of course, one source of financing. But we are not the only source. We are normally a temporary source that phases our support in, but we are in fact just as interested in seeing how can we phase our support out again, and how can that be that support be taken over by other sources. And as we're looking for permanent changes of investment behavior in the private sector, we would also be looking for permanent sources of finance. And that source would typically also be the public sector budget.
Well, depends, right? Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. But we do have, when the instruments that are promoting certain investments, when the public sector instruments that have this capacity of directing investments in a certain direction, are also the public sector instruments that would be able to raise the long-term financing. It may well be that those instruments that we are bringing in cannot immediately be taken over by the national public sector, so there would be a need for other sources of finance to face that different financing in. Let me give you an example, because it's also a question of who are we actually looking at to raise that kind of financing. Say, for instance, air conditioners for households. They have a certain energy efficiency. We would like to raise that efficiency to reduce energy consumption, but that would mean that the average price of air conditioners for households would go up. Now, we as a financing mechanism could foresee, for instance, a temporary sweetener. We could, even though it's not the most cost-efficient way to do so, we could put in a small grant for that investment, and that grant would then phase out again until the households would get used to a different and higher price level for the investment. Mostly they would in fact earn that extra investment back from saved energy. But we are now expecting the households to provide that financing, the long-term financing, simply by buying more expensive equipment. But you could also see an option where the public sector could participate in that. There may well be a situation where these ACs are imported and the import tax on those would be 20% and applied across the board. But you could in fact reduce the import tax on the most efficient air conditioners and by that reduce the actual retail price. In that case, the financing would have been provided by the public sector. And very often you would see those, a combination of those two sources as the optimal way in which you can establish financing mechanisms.
Now, when we look at the NAMA support projects and what we being offered as financing mechanism in the outlines, it's mostly not public sector instruments as depreciation rules or taxes or subsidies. It's mostly it's concessional loans directly to the private sector, concessional loans, or even grants sometimes, or guarantees to the banks to lower the risk. So why is that so? Do you have any idea?
I'm afraid that in many cases those that develop NAMAs are still having a more project-oriented approach. It's a temporary intervention of one or another kind. So a project approach fits well with a temporary mechanism that we put in with an NAMA facility in a bank, for instance, as a subsidy on interest rates, for instance, in a certain period of time, and then we're out again, and that was then the NAMA. And we would, in fact, very much like to see a more permanent change in the financing structure, where we see these public sector financing instruments also applied.
Yeah, that comes together with, say, our projects are named NAMA support projects. So NAMA support projects fitting into a wider NAMA and supporting a wider sector scheme. And this is actually what we're looking at.